In this series of lectures, I'm going to talk a little bit about Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. In this opening lecture, I'm just going to talk about the book more generally and the author and do a little overview of some of the major themes in this text. If I'm reading any quotes, they come from the Broadview edition um, of the text, so Mary Shelley's Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus. This is the second edition from Broadview. So let's talk a little bit about Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. You'll notice I've included two images here. The one on the right is probably the image that most people are familiar with when they think of Frankenstein, and this is sort of a artist's rendition of the Boris Karloff film version of Frankenstein that we're probably more familiar with. So we usually, when we say the word Frankenstein, we usually come up with this image of this monster figure. Often he's sort of shown with green or very pale skin, with big bolts in his neck, and very sort of inarticulate, doesn't make much more than grunts and, small word replies. And this is an illustration from Shelley's text, from Shelley's text, where she depicts, or Frankenstein is depicted in a much more humanistic way. The monstrosity of the figure is, again, a different version than the one that we're sort of more familiar with. And as you get into reading the book, we'll get into more descriptions of how Shelley imagined the monster figure. So I'm going to do a little bit of information about the author, Mary Shelley. A lot more could be said again about her life. She led a very sort of interesting, eventful life with, in relationship to who her parents were, who her husband was, and her literary influences, and how she was, so prolific in writing at an early age. All of these things are really interesting. But I want to just sort of boil it down into a few key facts here. So Shelley was born in 1797, and she was the daughter of two of England's leading intellectuals, William Godwin and Mary Wollstonecraft. So again, if you're reading the Broadview edition of the book, it has a lot of supplementary materials, essays by William Godwin, Shelley's father, and Mary Wollstonecraft, Shelley's mother, and talks a lot about how her parents, their political involvement, their in ideologies really impacted Mary Shelley growing up. So her father was influential as a political philosopher and novelist, and he was William Godwin was a very sort of progressive political thinker, and he was kind of revolutionary in his ideas. I don't know, you can read more about it, but his beliefs are sort of considered the foundations of anarchy, and he talked a lot about principles of morality and truth in relation to society. And Mary Shelley's mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, she is the author of A Vindication of the Rights of Women, and a kind of pioneer in the first wave of feminism. So these two, very intelligent, politically and socially involved parents gave birth to Mary Shelley, who is the author of Frankenstein. Tragedy struck Shelley as she was born, and her mother died 10 days after giving birth to her, so she never grew up with that influence of her mother in her life. But again, the writings of her mother were impactful on her. So this idea of childbirth and death, birth and death are themes that are going to be relevant in our discussion of Frankenstein, and played a significant role in Mary Shelley's own life. She would also suffer multiple miscarriages in her relationship when she gets married to the poet Percy Shelley. So again, you can read, she married Percy Shelley very young, at a young age. He was already married. He left his wife. She committed suicide. There was a lot of drama. Eventually, he married Mary Shelley, and then she got pregnant, miscarried, had another child named William, and then published or wrote Frankenstein around the age of 19 in the year 1818. So her life was, again, full of these kind of traumatic moments around death, death of people who were influential on her, and also death in childbirth was a kind of repeated situation in her life with her mother and then her own miscarriages. So when we're situating the novel Frankenstein in a literary genre, it would easily fall under this category of Gothic horror. So Gothic texts have certain things in common. You might situate Frankenstein alongside other texts like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, or Dracula by Bram Stoker. So all of these texts have certain features in common. They're, scary at a basic level when you read them. They're intended to sort of disturb or inspire fear in the reader. Often there's supernatural elements. There might be ghosts, there might be, monsters, there might be, figures that don't exist in reality. Often there's sort of mysteries involved. The locations are often very dark. There's lots of thunderstorms and creepy haunted castles, and castles on the side of a mountain that's isolated. And it's a lot of sort of dark imagery that we associated with horror movies. Often there's kind of psychological violence or physical and psychological violence, and situations of murder. And I want to highlight this other aspect is the monstrous double. So in a lot of Gothic narratives, for example, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, there's often, the protagonist who's our kind of hero or anti-hero, and then there's this monstrous double. So it could be a doppelganger, somebody who looks the same as or appears almost parallel to the protagonist. And we'll see in Frankenstein that's the case with our protagonist, Victor Frankenstein, and he will sort of be doubled in a way by his monstrous creation, the monster. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. So monstrous doubles in the text involve Victor Frankenstein. So you'll notice right away that Frankenstein, the title of the novel, refers to the protagonist, not to the creature. The creature is actually not named. He's often referred to as the creature or the monster. And it's Frankenstein who the novel is named after, who is a person, a young man, who conducts the experiment and brings to life this secondary being. And as we'll see, the monstrous doubles, they kind of have parallel life journeys, or they have to sort of have parallel life experiences. We'll see that in this novel. And the monstrosity of this pairing, it's sort of the monster or the creature kind of reflects the negative parts of Victor's personality. So if Victor is viewed as prideful, the monster will also be viewed as prideful. If Victor is selfish, again, the monster will become selfish. So there is this kind of parallelism between Victor, who's the creator, and his creature, the monster that he creates. So certain parallels do exist. They both start off as very innocent, loving, and warm beings. They both desire the same things, love and companionship. They both turn sort of vengeful and violent, and they both are sort of possess this element of narcissism and quest for power. Shelley's novel also is influenced by the historical culture, social culture around her. Like I mentioned before, she was married to Percy Shelley, and Shelley was part of this artistic, literary group of intellectuals that was writing at this time. They were part of the Romantic movement or the Romantic era of art. And this period lasted roughly 1798 to 1892. So the Romantics, they valued emotion over reason. They often celebrated the natural world and often criticized man-made technology or man-made industrialism or anything that sort of defied or destroyed the natural world around them. So they celebrated nature in its sort of untouched form and really sort of explored that theme in their writing and in their art. So Shelley, we'll see, is using a kind of Gothic twist on the Romantic genre. And she'll sort of talk about themes related to nature, but in a weird sort of twisted way, in the sense that how Frankenstein sort of goes against nature by doing something very unnatural and creating a being that is very unnatural in his birth. So it's kind of a lesson not to cross the boundaries of nature. Some of the major themes in the novel include the following. These aren't, again, all of the themes in the novel, but these are some of the ones that can be highlighted. The first one is alienation versus connection. So to be alienated means you're alone, you're isolated in the world, and you suffer the consequences of that. Often you might struggle with depression or sadness. You might feel like it's you against the world if you're alienated. Often you live apart from society, not by choice. Sometimes you're excluded or kicked out of society. So that'll be the case in the text. At sometimes Victor alienates himself. He stays away from society, and then sometimes the creature, in the creature's case, the creature gets kicked out of society for being too different and viewed as ugly or monstrous. Connection between people, communities, families, those are celebrated in the novel, so they're shown to be important and nurturing, caring, and necessary. So we'll see at times the connection between family as something that every individual needs, and yet there's this idea that not everybody has access to those connections, that nurturing that we need to thrive in the world. So there's a kind of breakdown of family bonds, community connections, and the result is alienation from others. So these two ideas are kind of a conflict that affects both the creature and Victor. The idea or theme of creation is also expressed in the novel. So to create something, again, you could be, in different situations, you create something by being an artist or a writer. In Victor's case, he's a scientist or a science student, actually, and he is motivated to create a new life. And he does so by bringing the dead back to life. In this case, he pieces together different dead body parts into a new structure of a human, and then he finds a way to bring that into life. So he creates an unnatural being through his scientific creation. So we'll see, again, themes of nature, natural creation versus an unnatural form of creation in the novel. Science versus nature, that again plays into Victor's creation of this being that doesn't exist in nature. So yeah, there is this kind of conflict involved in the novel between the drive of science to innovate and progress and create new things. Um, and also, in some ways, it can defy the natural order of the world. So, in some ways, Victor's science again takes science too far, and he crosses some moral ethical boundaries by creating a life that didn't exist in nature. We see this as a conflict in the novel. The theme of loss of innocence or lost innocence is very much prevalent in the novel. We'll find once you start reading that both Victor and his creation, they both begin life as innocent, kind, loving, capable of nurturing and kindness and gentleness. And then we see how that is kind of corrupted and lost over the course of their lives. Both and eventually will become sort of vengeful, angry individuals. And they lost that kind of pure sense of goodness that they had when they were younger. So that's another theme we can think about. Revenge is another one. So both, as I mentioned, Victor and the creature will, again, shift from being innocent, kind, gentle beings to sort of being bloodthirsty, vengeful, to the point that revenge is the only thing that sort of consumes them. So revenge is another one. Another theme is prejudice. So we'll see how people's prejudice, their sense of discrimination against others who are different, can also be read into this novel. And particularly as it applies to Frankenstein's creature. So the monster or creature in the novel is deformed. He, again, is unlike any other human being that exists in the world. He has his birth was unnatural through science, through Victor's scientific experiment. And so he's different from every other human on the earth. He's unhuman, but he's also viewed by society because of his differences as being less than, as being monstrous or ugly. And we'll see many examples of prejudice against him based on just the way he looks. So he's, attacked by stones by the villagers just when he enters the town, just because of the way he looks. So the novel also addresses the ways that we are prejudiced as a society against people who may be different or other, who don't fit into social norms or who, defy our sense of able-bodiedness. There's a lot of, critical writing about this idea of prejudice and how the monster can sort of stand in place of marginalized groups. So it's a very interesting angle to read the novel in that light. And then the final theme that we'll discuss is this danger of hubris or playing God, the dangers of ambition. So the novel really places some responsibility and blame on Victor for doing something that defies the natural order. So in a way, he plays God in the novel by creating a new life through scientific experimentation. The natural way of creating new life, again, would be to procreate, to have sexual relationship and have that result in pregnancy and then to give birth. Frankenstein, so Victor does not do any of that. He decides he's going to go off on his own and use science as a way to create a new life. And in that way, he kind of takes nature into his own hands and plays God. So he's wielding he's playing a very dangerous game by wielding a lot of power that maybe is not meant for humans to wield or to possess. So in that sense, he has too much ambition. And the Greek word for that was hubris, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we discuss Victor as a kind of tragic hero figure. But that's basically the major themes in this novel. So just to recap, Victor alienates himself from his friends and family, and this is his obsession with his scientific invention. And also the monster will also become vengeful when he's isolated from society. So there is this theme evident in the text. Creation and parenting, in a way, Victor becomes a kind of father figure to his creature. And it's a kind of unnatural creation that he's done, defies the natural order. And he becomes a kind of bad father in a way because he abandons his child, and we'll see the ramifications of that in the text. But he's sort of created an offspring that is not unlike him and often reflects some of his worst qualities. The idea of hubris or ambition is also evident. Characters such as Victor, and we'll see also Walton is another sort of minor character in the story, but has similar attributes as Victor. Both of them are kind of blinded by dreams of being celebrated inventors or celebrated for their innovation, and they fail to consider the consequences of their actions. So they want all the glory, but they're not fully seeing the ramifications of what their actions are going to take on others. So yeah, there is this question of, is Victor being unethical or immoral in his pursuit of this scientific experiment? As I mentioned, science versus nature. So we'll see a sort of conflict between the expression of the natural world, natural order of things, and how science can sometimes take to that too far and in its attempts to sort of control nature, and how that can kind of backfire, and nature will eventually conquer all sort of man-made endeavors. So that push and pull between science and technology, or scientific expression of humanity and the natural world. The theme of revenge, again, very prevalent. We'll see the main revenge scenario involves Victor and his creature. That also involves a kind of loss of innocence, as both sort of lose their gentle, kind approach to life and devolve into kind of vengeful beings. The issue of prejudice will also be prevalent in the tale, where we have the creature being prejudiced against because of the way he looks, his outward appearance. Obviously, he's has scars, and often his size, his proportions are off. All of these things make him sort of physically unappealing, physically disturbing to the rest of human society, and he's cast out. So we see how he's prejudiced against, and it really reflects on this idea of who is monstrous in the story. Is it the creature that looks and acts, or who looks different, or is it humanity itself that is also possessed traits that are monstrous? And then lost innocence, again, a theme that's prevalent in the story, and how innocence can be sort of taken away from somebody through traumatic events, or through violence, or through just general sort of corruption of this pure way of viewing the world through kind eyes. The final thing I wanted to talk about is just the subtitle to Frankenstein. So you'll notice in your book, Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus is the subtitle. So it's a good idea to sort of look up the myth of Prometheus. It's a Greek myth about the creation of humankind. So again, a myth is just a narrative, a story that has maybe sacred meanings for the culture in which it was formed. So the myth of Prometheus. Prometheus created mankind from clay, and then he stole fire from the gods to give to mankind and taught his humans useful skills. As a result of creating mankind, he was punished by Zeus for stealing from the gods. So what does this myth, how does it reflect Mary Shelley's story? Well, it tells us a little bit of a pattern forming here. So the creation of new life, Prometheus creates new life, and he's doing so sort of outside the view of the gods. So he's kind of defying the gods by creating life. And then he's punished for it, for stealing from the gods by the god Zeus. And in the same way, we'll see this play out in Shelley's narrative when we have Victor Frankenstein creating new life in the form of his creature, defying the natural order of things by, using scientific methods that aren't the normal or natural way of creating new life. And then he'll be punished for that, for stealing some of this godlike power in the story, and we'll see how his punishment plays out with a lot of violence and death and revenge. So they're kind of parallel stories. In a way, Victor Frankenstein is the Promethean character who is a creator, and he creates, in this case, a new life form. And while he might have noble goals in mind, we also see how he's going to be punished for maybe taking this creation too far.